Well, Ed, thanks so much again for joining me. We're going to talk about some records, specific records, and we're going to talk about some people as well that you've worked with over your career. And you and I have corresponded a bit about the list, and I gave you, I think, a preposterously long list of people I'd love to hear about. And you actually came back with what I thought was a remarkably small winnowing down of that list. So hopefully we can have a good conversation today.
Right, you ask the questions, I'll try and provide the answers.
Okay. Well, let's start with a favorite record of mine, and one that's really, I think, had a second win critically too. It's really a greatly appreciated record these days, which is Ahmad Jamal's The Awakening, which, by the way, is devilishly difficult to find a copy of, but it's much prized. This record to me sounds like the beginning of the 1970s. So many styles, these incredible covers on it. Tell us a little bit about how that record was made.
It was made because Jamal was signed to the label and I was the new A&R man. So I booked Plaza Sound Studios, which was the studio in the Rockefeller Center, Radio City Music Hall, because that was a studio I was used to because Riverside used it all the time. And waited for Jamal. Plaza Sound had a 4-track machine, so I could record the piano, bass, and the drums separately, which was kind of a revolutionary new idea at the time. I had been warned that Jamal was very difficult. I think the phrase was he eats young Jewish producers for breakfast. He couldn't have been nicer. I introduced myself when he came in. I said, "First, Mr. Jamal, check the piano. I hope you like it. It's freshly tuned." And he sat down and said, "Yes, it's a very nice piano." I said, "Well, let's make a record." And we did. He said, "One thing, this is Ramadan, which, and I'm fasting. And the sun set is at 5:45 today. Tell me at 5:45 because I'm starving."
That record has it's got, as I mentioned, some great covers. It's got that wonderful arrangement of stolen moments
Yes, I had to ask him what the title was. I'd forgotten.
because it's from the old Oliver Nelson record, right? Seems
Yes.
to be.
And he said, "How can you forget it's on your label?"
Yeah. And also that terrific interpretation of Wave as well, which is one of my favorite songs anyway.
Yeah, Jamal is an astonishing player. I was working on the tapes back at the Village Recorder in Los Angeles, and Ray Brown was walking down the hall. I said, "Come on in, you got to hear this piano player." And I played him this extremely fast section of Jamal. And he looked at me and said, "Are you trying to impress me with fast piano players?"
It just feels like the vibe must have been good in the studio. It's a very positive sounding record to me.
Well, it was a working trio. Everybody was in a good mood. They knew that they'd get dinner at the end of the day, and they might as well have fun on in getting there.
Yeah, for sure. Just before we move off of Ahmad, that's a record which has been sampled a lot. And there is, of course, a ton of sampling that happens of all those old impulses. What's your take on all that?
I have absolutely no sense of what the music business and the recorded music business has become in the last 20 years. It baffles me. But I'm kind of like the classic cartoony old grandpa doesn't know how to deal with technology. So when I was in the middle of it, technology was my friend and I was master of it. But when I moved to Hawaii at the end of '88, I kind of fell out of the technical side of things. And the idea of sampling and sharing music is great, but it makes it very difficult for people who make their living making music and getting paid for recorded music to make their living.
Yeah. It seems like a double-edged sword. I mean, I think of the stuff that Us Three did when they sampled all those old Blue Notes. There's also an argument to be made that they kind of bring that music back into the public consciousness again, too, I guess.
Well, I mean, the nice thing about jazz and classical music is that it gets reissued. And sometimes it doesn't get reissued for 20 or 30 years. So to the audience, it's brand new when it comes out as a reissue. All I can hope for is that somebody at the record company is interested in the music, and will find a way to reissue things.
Yeah, and not let things just sit on the shelf.
The other interesting thing is that almost everything, not almost everything, but half of everything is available on YouTube.
Yeah, yeah, true enough. Let's talk about that. Just moving to Alice for a bit. Let's hear about that studio at Dix Hills.
Okay, it was built by a Decca engineer. It was a 4-track studio. It was nice. I would say it was a very advanced garage studio.
You got some pretty good sounds out of it.
Yes, it was a 4-track studio, and what we recorded on it was appropriate to 4-track. And I mean, I started out in mono, so 4-track was an exciting advance. But by that time, I was used to 16-track in California.
And it seems to me when you started out with Alice, it's a small group. You've got Alice, you've got Joe and Pharoah, you've got Ron Carter. Pata had a little group, but then you start to get when you do Journey and Satchitananda, then the drones start coming in, and you've got different bass players cycling in and out and so on. Seems to me.
Well, Turia was always very firm about who she wanted to play with. And since she knew the musicians better than I did and what she wanted to do, she always picked the right people. It was amazing considering the level of difficulty of the music and the kind of conception it required, that she never had people who weren't capable of executing right away.
Because she's doing really pretty advanced fusion stuff. Because she's taking those Indian drones and then layering over her own, jazz as it had evolved in her hands and Pharoah's hands and others into all that mix as well.
Yes, I mean, I talk about real fusion of influences, but she knew what she wanted musically because she came from a Detroit piano player's point of view. So she definitely had roots in jazz and gospel, and was a gifted pianist and a gifted composer. And she had the experience of living with and working with John for a long time. I mean, I actually enjoyed the quartet after McCoy left and she went in, because I can't explain the shift, but there was definitely a shift in the sound and the feel of the music.
I think it was Thiel did the Huntington Ashram Monastery record, Jaya Jaya Rama, that very bluesy track at the end of that. I mean, she's clearly got serious blues chops.
Oh yeah, and the thing with the 2 flutes on the first album you mentioned, Batavia.
Pata, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if there's ever a blues influenced track, blues meets spiritual, in a different way than Ray Charles made blues meet spiritual.
And then as things move on, she did this great work with Pharoah, and then certain point the sax is gone, and in comes a Wurlitzer organ by the time of Universal Consciousness.
Well, that organ of hers was a strange instrument, but she could bend notes on it, which is why I think she liked it, and she could make it sound like a human voice.
What was your response when this was going to be her sound? I mean, it's a little bit, I won't say it's divisive, but not everybody is as down with that sound as with some of her other stuff.
Well, I mean, who am I to tell an artist what the sound, his or her sound should be? She knows what she wants. All I can do is try and approximate it in recording and make it sound like it sounds in the room.
And then the strings start to come in too as well, because I think World Galaxy, there's a whole orchestra you're recording.
Yes, strings. The first time we used strings, she had Ornette Coleman arrange them, which was a strange choice. And then she realized that she could do it. Why have Ornette do it? She could do it. She knew what she wanted.
It was her desire to have the string orchestra. It wasn't you saying, let's use strings. She came in, wanted to do the strings.
No, absolutely. I've actually never suggested to an artist what this album's music should be about. At one point, somebody asked me what it was like dealing with her in the studio, and I said, she has a whim of tungsten.
By the time you get to like Lord of Lords, I mean, it's almost classical, large passages of that record. I mean, we're a long way from hard bop at this point.
Well, I think we started out a long way from hard bop.
Yeah, true.
And I mean, she heard sounds, and I hate to use the word cosmic because it sounds too much like a 70s comic book, but she did. She heard the whole cosmos vibrating. And I'll tell you something, that reminds me of a strange incident. For the track "A Love Supreme," she had her guru, Swami Satchidananda, come into the studio to put a benediction on it. And he said, "Can I warm up my voice?" So we put him in the studio and mic'd him and set up echo and quadraphonic echo just to see what it would sound like. And he came back in and listened to it. I said, "Is your voice okay?" He said, "My voice is okay, but the room sounds like it sounds up on top of the mountains. If you go high enough in the Himalayas, that's what it sounds like."
That reminds me of what John Lennon asked George Martin to do with his voice on "Tomorrow Never Knows." I think he wanted to be like a monk shouting on top of a Himalayan mountain. That was the instruction. So and then I think that was Lord of Lords. It was the end of the line for her at Impulse. And then was the label behind you all the way with respect to her, or were they?
No, the label was not behind her all the way, which is why they let her go when she was signed to Warner Brothers.
Mm. And then you did one record with her there, right? Eternity, yes?
There were I think 3 albums with her there. And that's when she started using the voices of her students, who may have been spiritually sound, but were not great singers.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's some good moments later in your catalog, but I mean, it's just a great time to be around an artist when she's in that kind of a zone.
Absolutely. Well, remember, with all the artists I was working with, they were all experienced musicians, and when I came to deal with them, they were coming into the studio and were basically concerned with representing what their music was, and which is a high place to begin.
Now, another person that really fits the bill with is Pharoah. Again, in preparation for this chat, I listened to didn't have time to listen to them all back to back, but large chunks of Jewels of Thought and Sumun Bukmun Umyun and Thembi. I mean, these are magnificent records, and one of the first of all, let's just talk about some of the people that were on those, because it's an absolute. I mean, he had such a stellar cast of musicians he was working with, like Lonnie Liston Smith and Cecil McBee.
Yeah, Cecil McBee was a surprise, because the first date I did with Pharoah was Cecil McBee and Richard Davis. And I told the engineer, set up the monitoring so the young kid is on the left and Richard is on the right. And first playback, the astonishing thing coming from the left, I said, "Hey, I told you to put Richard on the right." He said, "No, that's the kid." And immediately I grew over fond of Cecil.
I mean, he's a tremendous bassist, and as you say, the comparison, because Davis was a giant and so much facility in so many different classical, jazz, you name it.
At a certain point, it's all music, and the last people to be convinced of that are record companies. And is that your ringing or my ringing?
Oh, sorry, that's just people emailing me. I'm going to put a stop to that.
Okay, put a stop to it. Get stern. I'm sorry. Back to the question.
Oh yeah, well, we're just chatting about the people on those records, and Lonnie Liston Smith too.
Yeah, actually, I don't think Lonnie and I exchanged more than 5 words in the total time I recorded him with Pharoah. Like somebody explained to me that Pharoah was not uncommunicative. He was shy. And I think Lonnie may have been even shyer than Pharoah.
Often feels to me in that phase of Pharoah's career, it's almost as if he'd taken the bass riff from A Love Supreme and all those different ostinatos that he would have on all those records and just took it in all kinds of crazy directions, almost from that one point of just that rhythmic, almost droning feel.
At one point, somebody asked me to describe what recording Pharoah was like, and I said, the rhythm section sets up an amazing groove, and Pharoah takes that groove and shakes it apart and disintegrates it into free space. And then after a period of time, the musicians manage to coalesce and it comes back together to reformulate either that groove or a similar one. And that's it. The first part that's astonishing is how strong a player it is that he can shake a powerful groove apart, and how strong the groove is that it can reformulate.
And there's so much patience involved, right? Nobody's in a hurry to bring things to a close until they need to be brought to a close, seems to me.
What's the rush?
Yeah, exactly. And then by the time you get to, Suman Bukman Umyun and some of those, then the percussion section is just growing and growing and growing, seems to me.
Well, saxophonists and drummers, I think saxophonists are happiest when they're playing with drummers, and enough percussionists give them everything they want to. There's always something to play off. I'm told that when John Coltrane added a second drummer to the band, Elvin said, "What do you need another drummer for? I'm already hitting everything there is to hit." But two kinds of energy working separately give you more options.
Now, one other thing on just a bunch of things we could talk about with Pharoah, but I did want to note the fact that Elevation. Now, you recorded that live at the Ash Grove. Now, this must have been old home week for you.
Well, I mean, I hadn't been there for a long time, and the audience had changed considerably from the days at the beginning when it was really folky intense. But recording Pharoah was, here comes the gypsy caravan, self-driven, self-equipped, ready to present itself, and all you had to do was set up the mics and let them run.
Tell me a little bit about recording at a club, because I know you recorded Alice at a club as well. So what's different about doing that?
Okay, first of all, recording in a studio is easier because you can control the sound. In a club, you're always dealing with the audience, the microphones, it's the club sound guy. But I actually think the music is better recorded in front of an audience. And I always thought the perfect studio setup would be a stage and an audience space so you could have maybe 100 people in there, because when musicians are playing for an audience as opposed to playing for microphones, they forget about the microphones and they concentrate on the music. In a studio, I have to be that audience.
And there's an artificiality to it, I guess, for the musicians in some way.
I think in the beginning of recording, for the first 10 or 15 years, that may have been the case. But by the time you get to the period I was in, a musician regarded a studio as familiar space. You just don't get the immediate feedback that you get from an audience.
If you don't mind, I wouldn't mind talking about another period of time at Impulse, or at least another piece of work you did at Impulse, which was the work with Gato Barbieri.
Working with Gato was a lot of fun, mainly because Gato was like a kid, and you had to deal with his mommy, who was Michelle, his wife, who took care of the serious business. And Gato's job was to play and to pick the musicians.
And there were a lot of them.
Yes.
So was that his whole band? Is that all his band, or did you source those guys locally, or how did it work out?
Well, the first thing I did with Gato was go to South America and record in Buenos Aires and in Rio with what he called his folkloric band. and his samba band and his tango band.
That's an amazing piece of fusion, that record. I mean, it's not like anything I can think I've ever heard.
Well, because it was music recorded in its natural habitat. I mean, the first thing I discovered at a rehearsal in Buenos Aires at a sailor's bar down by the waterfront where we were rehearsing the tango rhythm section. I felt like I was in a 40s black and white noir film. And the tangos have to be heard in their context the same way a Chicago blues has to be heard in its context. The Chicago blues played by a studio band isn't the same as a Chicago blues played in a lounge.
And this must have been probably the only economic way to make that record, eh, was for you to go down with your mics?
Excuse me, economics. One of the reasons I was going down there was because the ABC's licensees in South America were reluctant to get off the fees that they owed the parent company in the United States. So the theory was I was going to go down and they'd pay for the studio costs. But of course they didn't. That whole trip was paid for on my credit cards.
Yours?
Yes.
Did you ever get paid back?
Yes, at the end of the year, Lee Young, who was the A&R supervisor, Lester's brother, the drummer, called me into his office and said, "Why is it that your expense account is bigger than the expense account of everybody else in the production department?" And I said, "Lee, how many albums have everybody else in the production department made this year, as opposed to how many albums I've made this year?" He said, "Yeah, you made twice as many records as all the rest of them put together. But that's not fair because they're jazz albums." I said, did they have to pay for their their studio albums on their credit cards, which they have to charge on their expense account? He said, "Okay."
And was that your first time in Buenos Aires?
Yes, first time in South America.
How did you like it?
I was in a daze, but a great daze.
Did you guys agree all 4 chapter records in advance, or did you sort of decide them as you went along?
Gato and Michel, like me, were crazy movie people. And Michel noted as soon as we got started that we were making a serial, that every album was a cliffhanger. So it was chapter 1, chapter 2.
Did you ever make a movie soundtrack?
I did. I worked with Jimmy Bond, the bass player and composer, who was a pal of mine, for a really cheapo blaxploitation film called Trick Baby.
I've not seen it.
Nobody else has either. It must have been the mid 60s.
Can we talk a bit about Sun Ra? We did the other day, and you mentioned how Blue Thumb had stepped in when
He had stepped out.
yeah, exactly. And then you made Space is the Place, at least, and I think there might have been another one as well. But can you tell me about that session?
Yes. The band was going to be in Chicago and we record there. And there was only one studio with 16 tracks available, Streeterville. I didn't know the studio, but when I got there, I saw they had a 16-track machine and 16 lines coming in from the studio to the control room. So I said, "Geez, since there are 4 drummers playing in the band, and all the horn players have to be double mic'd because they're changing instruments all the time, and Sonny's playing 3 or 4 different keyboards, we're going to have a hard time you getting that down to 16 lines going into the control." And they said, "No problem. We do a lot of advertising work. So we'll go to all the ad agencies and get submixers for everything." So there's a console, submixers, and an army of musicians.
And his whole setup, I mean, it was almost a commune, wasn't it? Wasn't so much an employed band as such, was it?
Well, the only thing I would change is removing the word almost from almost a commune. it was also a disciplined military unit. So the first time we got to the studio, the band, I think we started at noon, and at 11:30 nothing was done. At a quarter of 12, the back door of the studio opened up and the band trooped in and set up. Everybody they had two big ring binders full of the arrangements, and everybody doubled and tripled. And by noon, everybody was set up in their place, but Sonny hadn't shown up. And about a quarter after, he came in hopping mad and proceeded to deliver this strenuous lecture to the band saying, "I'm your leader. It's your responsibility to get me to the gig. I was sent here by the higher powers of the universe to be your leader. You've got to take care of your share of the business." Then he gave us the rules of, we're going to do one take of everything. I said, how can we, since every tune is different, how am I going to know the balances? You got to give me a rehearsal take, and then we can finish take. He said, okay, but you can't record the rehearsal take. You can only record the finish. And in one long day's session and one short day's session, we recorded enough for 4 LPs, 2 of which went to Blue Thumb, 2 of which went to Saturn. The second Blue Thumb album, I am told, was used to squeeze out a budget for an imaginary rock and roll band that never existed. So I never heard that again.
Mm. Was Sonny based in Philly then, or was he in Chicago? Where was he?
At that point he was in Chicago. He was done with the Philly.
Yeah. Wow, what an amazing scene. Now, so I personally think Space is a Place sounds pretty good. Were you happy with it?
Oh yes, and I mean I was deep into quadraphonic sound, and that was the quaddest record I've ever made.
Yeah, I've never had a chance to listen to a good quad setup. I'd love to do it.
You and 99.9% of the other listeners. There's a group of people in LA now, and apparently nationally, who are trying to bring quad back, which is much easier to do with computers.
I guess it would be. Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, really, the whole surround sound thing is a similar kind of principle, it seems to me.
Yes, but I mean, if you design the music to be heard that way, it can be pretty convincing and pretty amazing. When I'd mix an album, because it was encoded so that the stereo would unfold. So we'd mix an album in stereo, and I'd play back once the album was assembled, I'd play it back for the artist, so give any corrections that need correcting. And after they'd heard it in stereo, I said, "You want to listen to it in quad?" And they said, "Well, maybe for a minute." I said, "Okay, this button here, press it once, it'll fold into quad. Press it again, it'll fold back down into stereo." So we'd start out in quad, and I'd reach over to fold it down into stereo, and every artist I did it for would slap my hand away. So they liked listening to it that way, which was a convincer.
We talked a little bit about the other folks that you worked with, and one person who I don't know how much you worked with him directly, but he's a bit of a landmark in the jazz world, of course, Rudy Van Gelder. But you did record in his studio a few times, seems to me.
Once.
Just once.
Once with an Archie Shepp date, which required, I think, 3 or 4 taxis to bring everybody from Manhattan over to Rudy's studio in New Jersey.
What was that experience like?
I found myself very displeased by the fact that Rudy took a very bossy attitude towards musicians. And I realized that he was a little bit afraid of musicians. I like to sit behind the console, and Rudy didn't like me. He said, "Quit trying to steal my secrets." And I said, "Rudy, your secret is that you got a 2-track console that you built into a 4-track console that you've modified up to 16 tracks. I'm used to 32-track consoles at home. So I don't need to steal your secrets. Thank you very much, because I don't want to build it back down into 2-track anymore."
And then around that time, it was well, I don't know if was Bob using him with Flying Dutchman. I think he might have been.
I'm pretty sure he did. A lot of people liked Rudy's sound. I always was offended by the fact that Rudy made all piano players sound the same. Also, I think Rudy had the idea of what the rhythm section should sound like, which was not what the rhythm section sounded like when they were recorded the way they were playing.
If you think about the hard bop era and how many hard bop records, what percentage of hard bop records Rudy himself recorded. I mean, he's defined a sound which maybe didn't exist in the wild.
Well, it's true. I mean, he was recording everything for Blue Note and for Prestige and for a couple of little labels besides for a long time.
Also, on the technical side, Bill Simchick is a guy whose name pops up a lot next to yours. What was it like working with Bill?
Oh well, first of all, Bill and I were buddies. Our offices were across the hall from each other, and we smoked a lot of dope together. And I actually thought I knew something about recording till I hung out with Bill and realized that my ears needed refocusing in rock and roll terms.
So, what was his background? By the time you met him, what had he been doing previously?
He was an engineer, worked as an engineer, and worked his way up to a producer. And he was a great engineer and a great producer. I mean, he had something that I did not have, which was a pop sensibility. I mean, I was interested in representing what the artist was doing. He wanted to make hit records.
When you moved to Impulse, of course, Bob had been recording BB King for a while, it seems to me, and then he took over as BB King's producer. But then eventually you started to produce BB King.
That's because there was an earthquake in LA and Simzik moved to Denver.
That's the reason, eh? Act of God.
That's it. The morning of the earthquake, I got into the office. I hit about, I called between 6 and 6:30 in the morning. So once I figured out my kids were safe, I wanted to go into the office just to get rid of the shakes. And Bill, who never showed up before noon, was there ahead of me and saying, I hate LA, I hate earthquakes, I hate ABC, I'm getting out of here.
That was the final straw.
Yes.
But that meant you got a chance to work with BB King.
Yes. I mean, the fact is, they shouldn't have given me BB King because at that point he was making hit records. And my sensibilities were not tuned to making hit records. I have nothing against it, but I don't think this is going to be a hit. Let's stop everything else and pursue the hit.
So now you did an album with BB King in London, yeah?
Yes, that's when everybody was going to London to record people. So I called Alexis Corner and got the use of some people. And Joe Zagarino, who engineered it, he was living in London. He had worked with Bill, and he claimed to be able to produce a lot of rock and rollers.
You also produced another blues giant, John Lee Hooker.
John Lee was more fun than almost anybody. He had great energy. There are people who can walk into a room full of musicians and change the vibe for the better. I also assume there are people who can change the vibe for the worse, but I wasn't interested in it. But John was that way. He would show up and the groove would change.
He had a way, just with him and his guitar, of just this incredible rhythmic shuffle he would lay down. And then the earth just stopped spinning on its axis while he's playing, seems to me.
It was trying to have a gang of people waiting in murderers row for their turn to play with him. Everybody wanted to play with John Lee.
You made a record in a prison with him, yes?
Oh, yeah, at Soledad. I think on a Sunday morning, we were going to record outdoors. And we showed up with a Wally Hyder truck and went into the warden's office. And the warden was on vacation and the assistant warden was in charge. and a guy with killer's eyes. You know, he was just waiting for a chance to shoot somebody. And he said, "Where's your artist?" Because John Lee didn't show. So I called him at home in San Francisco. He said, "Oh, didn't my manager tell you we couldn't make it today?"
So you've got a riot in your hands, do you?
We quickly rescheduled for 2 weeks from then. Came back, and then there was an electrical failure problem with the on stage power. So I think we were limited to 2 amplifiers, but it was just a real cock up, and it is scary looking at the audience, self-segregated audience where nobody was moving. And I was used to people with John Lee Hooker audience really getting into the groove. It was body music, and seeing everybody sitting there like stone was scary.
Was that like a high security prison?
Yes.
So not quite the Johnny Cash vibe.
No, it was. There were the Soledad brothers were celebrated by the leftist community. It was a scary place to be, and when we went in, the recording truck was emptied out and every item was examined. I said, "What's the problem?" And one of the guards said, "Last week some visitors tried to bring shotguns in."
So it was a little tense.
A little tense. Not my favorite album. I try not to think about it too much.
Fair enough. Well, let's move on to another blues guy, Mel Brown. A lot I want to ask about Mel Brown, but or I could, but one thing I want to know is, was your relationship with the label deteriorating by the time that you came up with the record title 18 Pounds of Unclean Chitlins?
No, we were in good shape. And that was Mel's title, by the way.
So tell me about working with Mel.
Oh, he was a lot of fun. He and Clifford Coulter, to whom he introduced me, were reliable rhythm guys. If I had anything to do with blues or R&B or black dance music, I'd try and get them on the gig because they'd help it out.
So they were your kind of first call session guys, eh?
Yes.
Now, had he done a lot of work as a leader before his work with Impulse, of course?
No, his first recordings were on Impulse.
Why Impulse? Why not Bluesway?
God alone knows. because he recorded on Impulse, he stayed on Impulse. And Bluesway was not a very heavily supported label, even less so than Impulse.
I mentioned there were a few other folks that we agreed that if you wouldn't mind just sharing your thoughts of working with that person or your reflections on them. Albert Ayler.
Albert was a puzzle. I mean, when I went back to record him, I was not past middle period John Coltrane. So Albert was a shock. And the fact that he was using a rock and roll guitar player in the band and still playing what I thought of as Albert's music was a little unsettling, and I had to really trust the artist. But I did, and it was okay. To this day, I don't understand what it was that caused Albert's body to be found in the river.
No, that was very near the end, wasn't it? Your recording of him.
Yeah, very clear the end.
Yeah. Did you have any sense of his mental state at the time?
No.
How about Marion Brown, another avant-gardist?
Marion was. I knew him because I admired the ECM record, Georgia Fawn, and Marion was a very deliberate recording artist. He knew what he wanted to do. He knew the people he wanted to record with. He had prepared material, and he liked storytelling records. He made the poetry be a narrative part of the music. And when I started with Pacific Jazz, poultry and jazz was a feature. So I got involved early on and didn't think very much of the idea of poetry and jazz, that they belonged in separate boxes. But Marion made it work.
Mhm.
and he knew killer rhythm sections.
We talked about some great bass players before, and you can't talk about great bass players without talking about arguably the greatest, Ron Carter. What's it like working with Ron?
I'm very conflicted with Ron. Ron, you knew what you were going to get when you got Ron. He'd always be in the right place with the right note at the right time, but you were never going to be surprised. And I miss that sense of surprise. But I mean, if Ron was on the date, you knew the bass was covered. You didn't have to worry about anything.
Because he's been on something like 2,000 dates, and I guess that's why. Because from a producer's point of view, he's reliable.
Yes, absolutely. Talking about that number of dates, Howard Roberts once said, after the first 25,000 dates, there aren't many surprises left. 4 or 5 dates a day, 5 or 6 days a week, 52 weeks a year for 25 years.
Wes Montgomery.
I recorded his brother. I knew Wes very well from Riverside.
So what was Wes like as a person?
Your favorite cousin. He was just wonderful. I mean, he was a family guy. At one point, I took my mother-in-law down to, I forgot whether it was the half note or the 5 spot. And she was kind of a jazz fan of the old school. And she was delighted by Wes. And he came over and sat down with us. And they spent half an hour showing each other pictures of their grandchildren.
Did you ever get a chance to work with Stanley Cowell?
Yes, I recorded Stanley for a long time. He was one of my pet rhythm section guys. Stanley was the second best prepared pianist I ever recorded. The best being Hank Jones. It was fun to record him as a side man and fun to record him as a leader because he could do absolutely anything. Stanley was a genuinely smart guy. And that's rare among musicians because smart sometimes gets in the way of music. And for Stanley, it never did.
Speaking of piano players, Tommy Flanagan.
Another one of my pets. Tommy, like Hank, had been through every musical situation known to man and many not known to man. But he was just hasty. Whatever he played was fun to listen to and thought-provoking.
He's a consummate session guy as well. You can tell when somebody can play and is well liked when they're popping up all the time on other people's records.
Well, I mean, they're 100% reliable.
Philly Joe went through phases of being reliable and not so reliable in his career.
When I was recording him, he was in a reliable phase. I did a couple of albums under his name, and was he a sideman on things? I've forgotten. Warren Keepner put that together. And actually, when I was recording Philly, I decided to stop smoking reefer for a month. And he got really pissed off at me and said, "Why are you doing this on my time?" And I said, if I thought it would interfere with my abilities as a producer, I wouldn't stop.
And of course, Red Garland, whom you also worked with, was also
Yes.
from that era.
Yes. I mean, Red was the perfect cocktail pianist. But in addition to that, he was one of the great swing players. And he knew every tune ever written and the intro to it.
There's a story about Red Garland, which exists only on the back of one record in the liner notes. He went 8 rounds with, I can't blank to the name of the boxer, Sugar Ray Robinson, that's it.
Yeah, I think it was Sugar Ray, yeah.
Do you know if that's true?
He said it was.
If he told you, we'll take it as gospel.
He told Miles. That's why Miles liked him, because he liked having a boxer in the band.
That's right, because Miles was big into boxing for fitness, wasn't he?
I think he just liked to hit people.
What about we talked a bit about him before, but not so much. Joe Henderson.
The Phantom. Joe Henderson was the only tenor player I knew who could arrive at a day, take his horn out of the case, put it in his mouth and play and be perfectly in tune.
He seems to fly under the radar when people talk about the great saxophonists.
He's an amazing saxophonist. He's definitely top five. Yeah, I mean, on Patah the El Daoud, on breaks, it was fantastic to sit and listen to Pharoah and Joe talk about the mechanics of the saxophone.
What were the mechanics they were interested in?
How to play notes that aren't on the horn.
Roy Haynes, they're talking about guys who have been on a zillion dates. There he is playing with Monk and Bird and all those guys. And then decades later, he was still getting the calls.
At one point, I told Alice Coltrane we should use him. And she said, well, does he know the music? I said, John used him as a sub when Elvin was in the joint.
I think he's actually on one or two of their records, actually, on Impressions, I think.
He's a wonderful drummer. I recorded a lot of wonderful drummers, but Roy may have been the wonderfulest.
What's he like as a person?
Are you old enough to remember Esquire magazine?
I am indeed.
Esquire in the 40s and 50s had their 10 best dressed men in America, and Roy made it one year. So he was very conscious of his presence and appearance. And I asked him where he learned to dress that way. He said from hanging out at the Apollo Theater and watching the dancers and the pimps. And he said, and of course, Duke.
I also read that he and Miles shared a love for fine cars, and they used to race their cars in Central Park at night. Roy had a new Buick and Miles had something similar. Anyway, the first cars they ever got, and in the early 50s. And they would take their dates there and race maybe other things too in Central Park at night. But
I have no trouble believing it, but I've never heard that story.
No, I got to sneak a Canadian connection in here. Gil Evans. You ever cross paths with Gil?
Yeah, I had always idolized Gil. And the first day of working with him in the studio, actually working on the RCA Victor albums, transferring them to CD. There were a lot of ways to expand tracks, making use of unreleased material. So we did it, and Gil and I got along great. And I called my old lady in Tucson and said, remember I said I thought it was going to be like working with Ravel? It's not, it's like working with Bach. At one point I said, Gil, if I were really rich, I would pay you whatever you wanted to write a big band arrangement of Weatherbird. And he said, I don't think I could. But Gil pointed out to me once that he was as old as jazz was, and that he started listening to jazz when he started listening to Louis Armstrong records when they were new.
Yeah, and then that whole the birth of the cool sessions too. He's right in there at that sort of critical moment as well.
And the band at Sweet Basil at the end was quite different than anything else, because Gil really, like Duke, took advantage of the sound of the individuals in the band. And a couple of guys who played with Gil said he was more concerned with your sound than what notes you played.
I'd asked you about a few people on the label and production side, and a couple names has popped up there. One was George Avakian.
Avakian was kind of one of the people I wanted to grow up to be. He made a lot of great records. So I met him when I was working at Riverside. I called him up and said, I'd like to meet you. I'm a young producer and I'd like to just meet you and be able to tell people I met you. So we met up at his family's loft. The family was rug importers. And we're standing in the middle of a block-long, gigantic concrete empty space filled with piles of rugs going up 10 feet. And I'm leaning back on one and saying, talking to him, and George says, be careful, those are $25,000 rugs you're leaning against.
There's a tremendous photograph of him and Dick Bach standing in front of a world map. And I think Dick had just lured him over. Had he lured him to Pacific Jazz at some point?
Yes, George bought in as a partner, which is how the Gil Evans records got, and the Jazz Messengers got on Pacific Jazz.
And were you there at the time, or was that
Just before me? George bought the shares of one of the owners of Drum City, Roy Hart, studio drummer and all-purpose music business hustler, was one of Dick's original partners, and he sold his shares to George.
another guy from the time in California, Lester Koenig?
Les Koenig was the other guy I wanted to grow up to be.
I'm going to mispronounce everybody's name because I've only ever seen these guys' names on record covers.
Well, his son, John Koenig, is second generation producer. He went to law school because he saw what lawyers had done to damage his father. Les was a pure soul, and he made great records, made very careful records with good people. He was the first one to record Ornette. Nobody pays any attention to the two contemporary Ornettes, which would precede the Atlantic stuff. But that was a hard time to get next to Ornette because the bands were kind of unfinished.
Again, just dwelling in California, you said you'd had one interaction with Brubeck and Desmond.
Oh, because their 25th anniversary reunion tour was going to be recorded for Horizon, A&M's jazz label that John Snyder was recorded for. So we went out, got a recording truck, and went into the wilds of northern Wisconsin and Michigan to record the band. And I can remember driving through tunnels of snow that were taller, 12 feet high on each side of the highway, and thinking, this is not why I moved to California. But we recorded 2 nights, and the second night, there was a spectacular take 5. And I said to Joe Morello, come out to the truck. You got to listen to take 5, because he'd do a thing where he'd go around the set with his brushes and not hit anything, just pass the instrument. And we mic'd it so that you could hear the brushes going in stereo. And he said, I really don't think I'm coming out to the truck. My mind wouldn't be on it. My eyesight is going. My one good eye is showing the signs that my one bad eye showed when it went wrong. And the tour is over. I'm on a plane to my eye doctor tomorrow morning.
What a strange place to record them. Why did you end up going up there?
One reason was that one of the towns was owned by the company that made one of the horrible wartime poison gases. But they had an auditorium that was almost an anechoic chamber, which is a strange thing. But there was no reverb from the room whatsoever. What you heard was what came off the stage and went past your ear and then never came back again. It was odd to record there, but we were going to record, I think, 5 or 6 nights of the tour that were fit together.
Right. So you were following the band, basically.
Yes.
Yeah. And did you chat with Desmond or Brubeck at all?
No, I was busy in the truck trying to get things organized. But I remember Desmond, I always admired because of his wit. And they were talking about a tune, and Dave said, well, after I get done playing that honky tonk thing, you come in and play. And Paul, with an absolutely straight face, said to himself, not to Dave, "Whoa, you messing with Whitey's card game."
Yeah, he was an original.
He was a handful of originals.
Yeah. Look, Ed, this has been just a tremendous conversation again. I'm very, very grateful for you spending time. I was thinking, well, is there another question I wanted to ask you at the end? And and maybe this may not be a very original question, but is there a record that you didn't make that you wish you had?
Oh, millions of them.
Try me on one.
Any Duke Ellington record, any Charlie Parker record, almost any Lester Young record.
That Ellington Coltrane record is always a fascinating one to me. You just feel the different dynamics between the two bands, and when they, depending on who's backing them up.
Absolutely, because they're both great listeners.
Which is a defining characteristic of so many great players. Look, Ed, it's been a real pleasure. I know, speaking of listening, people are going to love listening to this conversation. You've been very, very generous with your time. And just on behalf of myself and the folks that watch this channel, thank you so very much.
You're welcome. Thank you for supporting jazz. Email me a link so I can find the rest of your shows.
Here it comes. Okay, sounds good, Ed. Take care.
Peace.
Peace. Bye-bye.